Life can change in an instant, and on a warm summer evening in a quiet suburban neighborhood, that's exactly what happened. The streetlights had just flickered on, casting long shadows across the community park where a group of teenagers were enjoying what they thought would be just another ordinary night of basketball. Among them was a tall, skinny 14-year-old boy, his sneakers squeaking against the concrete as he practiced his jump shots. The rhythmic bounce of the basketball echoed through the evening air, mixing with the sound of laughter and friendly trash talk. These kids weren't causing any trouble, they were just doing what kids have always done, making the most of their summer freedom. But someone in one of the nearby houses had a different view of the situation. They saw shadows moving in the dark, heard voices that seemed too loud for their comfort, and decided to call the police about suspicious activity in the park. They didn't stop to look closely enough to see it was just neighborhood kids playing basketball. Officer James Cooper was nearing the end of his shift when the call came in. He'd been on the force for 3 years, and calls like this had become routine. Too routine, perhaps. As he pulled up to the park, his headlights off to maintain the element of surprise, his mind was already filled with assumptions about what he'd find. The sound of his car door closing made the teenagers freeze. The basketball stopped bouncing. In the dim light, the officer saw figures moving, and his training kicked in, but not the right kind of training. Instead of announcing himself clearly and assessing the situation, he immediately went into what he later would realize was an unnecessary defensive stance. "Don't move." Cooper's voice boomed across the court, his hand already reaching for his taser. The kids, startled and confused, did what scared teenagers often do: they moved. Some backed away, others tried to explain they were just playing basketball. The tall, skinny boy took a single step forward, hands raised, trying to show he wasn't a threat. "Sir, we're just..." That's all he managed to say before Officer Cooper made a decision that would change multiple lives. The crack of the taser split the night air, and the boy dropped to the ground. His friends' screams echoed through the neighborhood as they watched their friend convulse on the concrete. It happened so fast. 1 minute they were playing basketball, the next minute their friend was on the ground, twitching while they stood helpless, phones already out and recording. One of them was crying, another was calling 911, and a third had the presence of mind to call their friend's father. Officer Cooper stood there, taser still in hand, as the reality of what he'd just done began to sink in. The boy on the ground wasn't a threat. He wasn't a criminal. He was a kid playing basketball with his friends, and as Cooper moved closer, the streetlight illuminated the boy's face. The officer felt his stomach drop. He knew that face, not personally, but from photographs in the courthouse where he testified dozens of times. This was the district attorney's son, the same district attorney who had helped Cooper put away dangerous criminals, who had trusted his testimony in court, who had even complimented his work ethic just last month. As the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, Cooper watched the boy's friends huddle around him, protecting him, comforting him. Their phones were still recording, capturing every moment of what had just happened. In their eyes, Cooper could see something he'd never wanted to see: pure fear of the very person who was supposed to protect them. The night air, which had been filled with the sounds of play just minutes ago, now crackled with tension. More patrol cars were arriving, and an ambulance too. Cooper could hear his radio crackling with questions from dispatch, but he couldn't find the words to respond. He just stood there, watching as the paramedics rushed to help the boy he'd just tased, knowing that this moment would replay in his mind forever. One of the boy's friends was still on the phone, his voice shaking as he spoke. "Mr. Williams, you need to come to the park right now. It's about your son." The police, he couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The sound of screeching tires in the distance told everyone that a father was already on his way, and this night was far from over. The world seemed to slow down as red and blue lights painted the basketball court in alternating colors. Officer Cooper's body camera was still recording, capturing everything: the scared teenagers, the approaching paramedics, and his own harsh breathing as he realized that a split-second decision had just set something much bigger in motion. Something that would force everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and the possibility of change. The screech of tires cut through the night as District Attorney Robert Williams's car rounded the corner. His heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear anything else. The phone call from his son's friend kept replaying in his mind, Broken words, scared voice, something about the police. 20 years as a district attorney hadn't prepared him for being on this side of an incident. The scene that greeted him looked like something from his worst nightmares. Red and blue lights bounced off the buildings surrounding the park. An ambulance sat with its back doors open, and a group of teenagers huddled nearby, their phones still raised, recording everything. But Williams didn't see any of that. His eyes locked onto the stretcher where paramedics were tending to his son. "That's my boy," he shouted, running forward. "I'm his father." The paramedics made way for him, and the sight of his son lying there, one of the taser prongs still stuck in his shirt, made Williams's knees weak. His son's eyes fluttered open, focusing on his father's face. "Dad." The boy's voice was shaky. "I didn't do anything wrong. We were just playing basketball." Williams grabbed his son's hand, squeezing it tight. "I know, son. I know." He looked up at the paramedics. "How is he?" "He'll be okay," one of them assured him. "But we need to take him to the hospital for observation. Standard procedure with taser incidents." That word, taser, hit Williams like a physical blow. He'd reviewed hundreds of police reports involving tasers, but reading about it in a report was nothing like seeing the aftermath on your own child. He turned around, looking for answers, and that's when he saw Officer Cooper standing there, taser still in his holster, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Williams knew Cooper. They'd worked together on cases. The officer had sat in Williams' office just last month, going over testimony for a drug trafficking case. Now here he was, having just tased Williams' son. "Mr. Williams," Cooper started to say, but Williams held up his hand. "Not now," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades in the courtroom. "Right now, I'm not the DA. I'm a father going to the hospital with his son. But tomorrow, Officer Cooper? Tomorrow we're going to have a very different conversation." The teenagers' friends crowded around Williams, all talking at once. "We got it all on video, Mr. Williams. He didn't do anything. We were just playing ball." Williams looked at their phones, still recording, and felt a complicated mix of emotions. As a prosecutor, he'd always told people to trust the system. Now his son was caught up in that same system. The paramedics started loading the stretcher into the ambulance. Williams turned to his son's friends. "I need you all to go home now. But tomorrow, I'm going to need you to come to my office. Every one of you. Bring your parents and those videos." As Williams climbed into the ambulance with his son, he could see more people gathering around the park. Neighbors drawn by the commotion, some already recording with their phones. News traveled fast in their community, and he knew that by morning, this would be everywhere. The ambulance doors closed, and as they pulled away, Williams watched Officer Cooper getting smaller in the back window. The officer was standing exactly where they'd left him, looking lost in his own uniform. For a moment, Williams felt a flicker of something unexpected, not just anger, but sadness too. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. In the harsh light of the ambulance, Williams held his son's hand and tried to process everything. He'd spent his career working with law enforcement, believing in the system, fighting for justice through proper channels. Now here he was, watching paramedics check his son's vital signs, all because an officer had seen a threat where there was only a kid playing basketball. His phone was already buzzing nonstop. The police chief, fellow prosecutors, reporters probably. But Williams wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about tomorrow and the days after that, and how this moment would change everything, not just for his family, but for their whole community. As they raced toward the hospital, Williams looked down at his son and made a silent promise. This wouldn't just be another incident report. This wouldn't be swept under the rug. This was going to lead to real change, not through violence or revenge, but through the same system he devoted his life to. He just had to figure out how to be both a father seeking justice and a district attorney upholding the law. The ambulance turned a corner, and Williams squeezed his son's hand tighter. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And maybe, just maybe, they could turn this terrible night into something that would help make sure no other father got a phone call like the one he'd received tonight. The morning after the incident, the police station was buzzing with tension. Officer Cooper sat in a hard plastic chair outside the Internal Affairs office, staring at his hands. He hadn't slept at all last night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that boy falling to the ground, heard those screams, remembered the look in District Attorney Williams' eyes. Officer Cooper? A stern-faced woman in a suit stepped out of the office. We're ready for you. The internal affairs interview room felt smaller than usual. 2 investigators sat across from him, a folder thick with preliminary reports between them and a video screen mounted on the wall. Cooper knew what was coming. They were going to review his body camera footage, frame by frame, decision by decision. Let's start from the beginning, the female investigator said, pressing play. The footage started rolling, and Cooper watched himself arrive at the park. Even now, seeing it from this angle, he couldn't believe how quickly everything had escalated. Talk us through your thought process here, the male investigator said, pausing the video. What made you approach without announcing yourself first? Cooper opened his mouth, then closed it again. The truth was, he didn't have a good answer. I guess I was thinking about the suspicious person's call. I wanted to maintain the element of surprise if there was criminal activity. Criminal activity? The female investigator leaned forward. The call was about noise in a public park. There was no mention of crimes being committed. They played more footage. Cooper watched himself shout commands, saw the boy step forward with his hands up. The video was crystal clear. There was no threat, no aggression, just a kid trying to explain himself. You deployed your taser 7 seconds after initial contact, the male investigator noted. Walk us through that decision. Cooper felt sick watching it again. I made a mistake, he said quietly. I read the situation wrong. I saw movement and I reacted instead of responding. The questioning went on for hours. They reviewed his training records, his previous incidents, his commendations from the department. Cooper had been considered a good officer, not perfect, but solid. Until last night. During a break, he stepped into the bathroom and splashed water on his face. In the mirror, he hardly recognized himself. What were you thinking? He whispered to his reflection. But he knew exactly what he'd been thinking, or rather, what assumptions he'd been making without even realizing it. Back in the interview room, they showed him something new, cell phone videos from the teenagers. The incident from their perspective was even worse. Their frightened voices, their confusion, their instinct to record everything because they didn't trust what might happen next. Do you know how many complaints we've received since last night? The female investigator asked. The chief's phone hasn't stopped ringing. The mayor's office is involved, and the DA. Is it true you've worked cases with DA Williams? The male investigator cut in. Cooper nodded slowly, many times. He's a good man. Fair, always professional. His voice cracked a little. I've testified in his courtroom at least a dozen times. And now his son is in the hospital because of your actions. The words hung in the air like smoke. Cooper had been trying not to think about that part, about how many times he'd sat in Williams' office, going over testimony, sharing coffee, talking about their families. He'd even mentioned his own kids once or twice. The investigators shared a look, then the female investigator leaned forward. Officer Cooper, we've reviewed the preliminary findings. There were multiple violations of department policy here. No proper announcement of police presence, no attempt at verbal de-escalation, improper use of force against a minor. The body camera footage clearly shows no immediate threat that would justify taser deployment. I understand, Cooper said quietly. Do you? She asked. Because right now, you're suspended pending the completion of this investigation. Your service weapon and badge have already been secured. But this isn't just about your job, Cooper. This incident has sparked something bigger. She was right. Outside the station, Cooper could hear the muffled sounds of protesters. News vans lined the street. Social media was exploding with the cell phone videos. This wasn't going away. One more thing, the male investigator said, sliding a piece of paper across the table. DA Williams has requested a meeting. Not as the DA, but as a father. He wants to talk to you, face to face. The choice to accept is yours, but given the circumstances. Cooper picked up the paper with trembling hands. He thought about his own kids, about how he'd feel if someone had hurt them. The right thing to do was clear, but it was also terrifying. I'll do it, he said. I owe him that much. I owe everyone that much. As he left the station that evening, ducking past reporters and protesters, Cooper realized something important. This wasn't just about one night or one mistake. This was about patterns and assumptions he hadn't even known he was carrying. And maybe, just maybe, facing those truths was the first step toward making things right. Word spread through the city like wildfire. By morning, the cell phone videos had gone viral, and the quiet suburb had become the center of a storm. News helicopters circled overhead, their blades chopping through the morning air as protesters began gathering outside the police station. The crowd was a mix of everyone: parents holding signs, teenagers wearing basketball jerseys in solidarity, community leaders with megaphones, and ordinary citizens who'd finally had enough. Their chants echoed off the buildings: "No more fear. Our kids belong here." At the community center down the street, a hastily organized town hall meeting was packed to the walls. People stood in the aisles, sat on the floor, crowded around the doorways. The air conditioning struggled to keep up with the heat of so many bodies, so many emotions. "My son plays at that same park," one mother said, her voice shaking as she spoke into the microphone. "He's on the basketball team too." It could have been him. It could have been any of our children. The police chief stood at the podium, sweating under the harsh lights. "We understand the community's concerns," he began, but was cut off by shouts from the crowd. "Understanding isn't enough anymore," someone called out. "We need action." An older man stood up slowly, leaning on his cane. The room quieted as he spoke. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 50 years, raised my kids here. Now my grandkids play in that same park. When I was young, we were afraid of the police. I hoped my grandchildren wouldn't have to feel that fear. But here we are, still having the same conversation." Local business owners had closed their shops to attend. Teachers from the nearby schools were there, some holding pictures of their students. Even the mayor had shown up, though he looked uncomfortable as he listened to speaker after speaker share their stories. "It's not just about one incident," a high school basketball coach said. "It's about every time our kids have to think twice about playing outside. Every time they have to worry that someone might see them as a threat instead of what they are: children." Outside, a group of teenagers had set up a basketball hoop in the parking lot. They were playing peacefully, wearing signs that read, "Playing basketball is not a crime, and we just want to play." News cameras focused on them, capturing the powerful image. Back inside, a police officer, not Cooper, stood up to speak. "I have 3 kids myself," he said. "What happened that night was wrong. But not all of us are like that. Some of us are trying to do better, to be better." The room grew quiet as District Attorney Williams walked in. He looked tired but determined. Everyone knew he'd spent the night at the hospital with his son. As he made his way to the podium, people parted to let him through, murmuring words of support. "My son is going to be okay," he began, and you could hear the collective sigh of relief. "He's bruised, he's shaken, but he'll recover. What I'm worried about now is how we heal as a community." Williams paused, looking around the room. "I've spent my career working within the system. I've prosecuted bad cops and defended good ones. I've tried to be fair, to see all sides. But when I saw my son lying on that stretcher," his voice caught for a moment, "something has to change." A young woman stood up, her phone in her hand. "The video has over 1 million views now," she said. "People all over the country are watching. What are we going to show them? That we can tear each other apart? Or that we can come together and make real change?" The mayor finally stepped up, clearing his throat. "I'm announcing the formation of a community oversight committee," he said. "We need citizens and police working together. We need new training programs, new policies. We need our kids to feel safe." Someone shouted, and the room erupted in applause. As the meeting continued, more people arrived. Some brought food, others brought stories. A local church opened its doors for people to rest and talk. The basketball players in the parking lot had grown to a full tournament, with parents and police officers watching from the sidelines. By sunset, the news cameras were capturing a different scene than they'd expected. Yes, there was anger, there was pain, but there was also hope. People were talking, really talking, about how to move forward. The teenagers who'd recorded the original videos were sitting with community leaders, sharing their perspectives on what needed to change. "This isn't over," Williams said as he left the meeting. "But maybe, just maybe, we can turn this moment into a movement. Not for revenge, not for headlines, but for real change. For our kids, for all our kids." As night fell, the basketball games in the parking lot continued under portable lights someone had brought. The sound of bouncing balls and cheerful shouts mixed with the serious discussions still going on inside. It was a reminder of what this was all about, the simple right of children to play without fear, and a community's determination to make that right a reality. The community center's small conference room felt like it was holding its breath. The mediator, a respected local pastor, sat at one end of the table. District Attorney Williams sat at the other end, his hands folded calmly in front of him. The middle chair remained empty, waiting for Officer Cooper. When the door finally opened, Cooper looked different than anyone remembered. Gone was the confident stride, the crisp uniform. Instead, he wore civilian clothes and carried the weight of the past few days in his shoulders. His eyes met Williams's for a moment, then dropped to the floor. "Please, sit down," the pastor said softly. The chair scraped against the floor as Cooper pulled it out, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Before we begin," the pastor continued, "I want to remind both of you that this is a safe space. We're here to talk, to listen, and hopefully to understand. Mr. Williams, would you like to start?" Williams took a deep breath. "I want you to know something, Officer Cooper. My son woke up twice last night from nightmares, not about the pain from the taser, though that was bad enough. He was dreaming about the look in your eyes right before you pulled the trigger. He kept asking me, 'Dad, why did he look at me like I was a criminal?'" Cooper's hands were shaking on the table. "I've been asking myself the same question," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've watched that body camera footage 100 times. I've read every report, but none of it explains why I made that split-second decision." "Then explain it to me now," Williams said, leaning forward. "Help me understand what my son could have possibly done in those 7 seconds to deserve that." "He didn't deserve it," Cooper said immediately. "That's the truth. I saw movement, I saw a shape in the dark, and I reacted based on assumptions I didn't even know I was carrying." The pastor nodded encouragingly. "Can you elaborate on those assumptions?" Cooper's eyes welled up. "I grew up in a different neighborhood, a different world really. My training taught me to be ready for threats, but somewhere along the way, I started seeing threats everywhere. Especially," he paused, struggling with the words, "especially in places and people where there weren't any. My son," Williams said quietly, "has played basketball in that park since he was 10 years old. He's in the honor society. He volunteers at the animal shelter every weekend. But none of that mattered in those 7 seconds, did it?" "No, sir," Cooper admitted. "In those 7 seconds, I forgot everything I should have remembered. I forgot my training about de-escalation. I forgot that kids play basketball in that park every night. I forgot that I'm supposed to protect people, not terrify them." Williams pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. "I want to show you something." He played a video, not from the incident, but from a month ago. It showed his son teaching Yampa kids how to dribble at a community basketball clinic. The sound of laughter and encouragement filled the room. "That's who you saw as a threat," Williams said, his voice firm but not angry. "That's who you decided needed to be tased within 7 seconds of arrival." Cooper couldn't take his eyes off the video. "I have kids too," he said softly. "My daughter's about his age. Last night she asked me why I hurt someone's child. I didn't have an answer for her." The pastor leaned forward. "Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones we need to have with ourselves. Officer Cooper, what have you learned from this?" "I've learned that I was carrying biases I didn't want to admit to. That my fear was hurting the very people I swore to protect. That 7 seconds of poor judgment can destroy trust that took years to build." Cooper looked directly at Williams for the first time. "I've learned that I need to change, and that 'I'm sorry' isn't enough." Williams nodded slowly. "You're right. Sorry isn't enough. But it's a start. What matters now is what we do next." "I want to make this right," Cooper said, "not just with your son, but with the whole community. I'll take any training, any consequences. I'll speak to other officers about what I did wrong. Whatever it takes." "It will take a lot," Williams said. "My son hasn't been back to that basketball court since that night. His friends jump when they see a patrol car. You didn't just taste my son, Officer Cooper. You taste their sense of safety, their trust in the system." The room fell silent again. Outside, they could hear the distant sound of kids playing, of life going on. Finally, Cooper spoke again. "Mr. Williams, I know I don't have the right to ask anything of you. But if you'll allow it, I'd like to meet with your son. Not to excuse what I did, but to show him that I see him now. Really see him." Williams studied Cooper's face for a long moment. "We'll see," he said finally. "First, you need to do the work. Real work, hard work. Are you ready for that?" Cooper straightened in his chair. "Yes, sir, whatever it takes." As they stood to leave, Williams paused at the door. "Officer Cooper, my son will play basketball in that park again. That's a promise. The question is, when he does, will you be someone he has to fear or someone he can trust?" The question hung in the air, a challenge and an opportunity all at once. And in that moment, both men knew that what happened next would depend on how seriously that question was taken. 3 months had passed since that night at the basketball court, and the police training room looked different now. Gone were the old posters about use of force and tactical response. In their place hung new ones about de-escalation and community engagement. Officer Cooper stood at the front of the room, facing a class of fellow officers. 7 seconds, he said, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "That's how long it took me to make the biggest mistake of my career. To forget everything I knew about protecting and serving." He clicked a button, and his body camera footage began playing on the screen behind him. The room was silent as they watched. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps seeing themselves in Cooper's actions. Others took notes, their pens scratching against paper as Cooper pointed out every mistake, every assumption, every moment where he could have, should have, done things differently. "This isn't just about one incident," Cooper explained, stopping the video. "This is about the biases we don't even know we're carrying, the fears we never question, the split-second decisions that can change lives forever." District Attorney Williams stood at the back of the room watching. He'd helped design this new training program, bringing in community members to share their experiences, their fears, their hopes. Today was Cooper's first time leading a session, part of his journey to make things right. Outside, in the parking lot, something remarkable was happening. The police department had set up basketball hoops, and officers were playing pickup games with local teenagers. It was part of a new community engagement initiative, breaking down barriers one game at a time. "The thing is," Cooper continued, "we can't police a community we don't know. We can't protect people we don't understand. That's why every officer here is going to spend time in our community programs, not as authorities but as neighbors." The chief of police stepped forward, adding his voice to the discussion. "We're changing how we measure success," he announced. "It's not about the number of arrests anymore. It's about the relationships we build, the trust we earn, the problems we solve before they become crises." Later that afternoon, Cooper walked through the park, the same park where everything had changed. A new basketball court had been built, with better lighting and benches for spectators. A mural on the nearby wall showed kids playing, watched over by a diverse group of community figures, including police officers. Young people were playing basketball, and this time, when a patrol car drove by, they didn't stop. They didn't freeze. The officer inside waved, and they waved back. Small steps, but important ones. At the community center, a new youth advisory council was meeting. Teenagers sat around a table with police officers, city officials, and community leaders, discussing everything from park curfews to police training. The boy Cooper had tased wasn't there yet. He was still working through his trauma with support from his family and counselors, but his friends were, making sure his voice was heard. "We need to understand," one teenager said during the meeting, "that trust goes both ways. We're not asking for special treatment, we're asking for fair treatment." The police department had made other changes too. Every officer now wore a body camera that couldn't be turned off during interactions with the public. De-escalation training wasn't just a one-time thing, it was ongoing, with monthly refresher courses and real-world scenarios. Cooper had been assigned to the Community Relations Unit, working directly with young people. It wasn't a punishment, it was a chance to be part of the solution. He spent his days in schools, community centers, and yes, basketball courts, building the relationships he should have had all along. The hardest part, Cooper told a group of new recruits, isn't learning new procedures. It's unlearning old habits. It's questioning everything you think you know about policing, about people, about yourself. District Attorney Williams had kept his promise too. His office now had a special unit dedicated to reviewing police interactions with minors. They worked closely with both law enforcement and community groups, making sure that what happened to his son wouldn't happen to anyone else's child. One evening, as the sun set over the park, Cooper watched a group of kids playing basketball. Their laughter echoed across the court, free and unafraid. A patrol car drove by, and nobody stopped playing. Nobody reached for their phone to record. Nobody felt the need to. "That's what success looks like," Williams said, walking up beside Cooper. "Not fear, not power, but trust. Real trust." Cooper nodded, watching the game. "How's your son doing?" he asked quietly. "Better," Williams replied. "He's talking about coming back to the court soon. On his own terms, when he's ready. I'll make sure he feels safe when he does," Cooper promised. As they stood there, watching the basketball game, both men knew that the work wasn't finished. Change doesn't happen overnight, and trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But with every game played without fear, every positive interaction between officers and young people, every honest conversation about mistakes and growth, they were moving in the right direction. The sound of basketballs bouncing and kids laughing filled the evening air, the sound of hope, of healing, of a community coming together to make sure that 7 seconds would never again destroy what takes years to build. 1 year had passed. The evening sun cast long shadows across the newly renovated basketball court, where a special game was about to begin. Bleachers had been set up around the court, filled with community members, police officers, and families, all gathered for what they were calling the Unity Game. District Attorney Williams' son stood at the free throw line, bouncing the ball slowly. It had taken months of therapy, support from his family, and his own inner strength to get to this moment. This was more than just his return to the court. It was a statement that fear wouldn't win. On one team were local teenagers wearing blue jerseys with community printed across the chest. On the other team were police officers, including Officer Cooper, wearing white jerseys with service on theirs. But this wasn't about competition, it was about connection. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice rang out, "welcome to our first annual Unity Game, where we celebrate how far we've come and remember why we can never go back." The crowd cheered as Williams' son made the opening shot. His father watched from the sidelines, remembering that terrible night a year ago, amazed at how much had changed. The police department had become a model for others across the country with their new training programs and community engagement initiatives. Cooper, now a full-time community relations officer, had spent the year speaking at police academies and departments nationwide, sharing his story and the lessons he'd learned. "It's not enough to admit mistakes," he would tell them. "You have to be brave enough to change because of them." The game was everything basketball should be: fun, exciting, and free from fear. Officers and teenagers played together, their natural competitive spirit balanced by mutual respect. When someone fell, hands from both teams reached down to help them up. When someone made a great shot, everyone cheered. During halftime, the mayor stepped onto the court. "A year ago, an incident on this very court showed us how much work we had to do," he said. "Today shows us how far we've come. Our police department has completely transformed its training. Our Community Oversight Board has real power. Our Youth Advisory Council is helping shape policies that affect their lives." The statistics backed up his words. Complaints against officers had dropped by 70%. Community trust ratings had soared. Other cities were sending representatives to learn from their example. But the real change could be seen in the small moments: kids waving at patrol cars instead of running from them, officers knowing the names of the young people on their beats, problems being solved through conversation instead of confrontation. Williams' son had become a leader in his own right, starting a mentorship program that paired young people with officers for basketball training and life guidance. "What happened to me was terrible," he told a reporter during a break in the game. "But instead of letting it break me, we used it to break down walls." Cooper had changed too. Gone was the officer who saw threats in shadows. In his place was a man who understood that real strength came from building trust, not wielding power. He'd learned every kid's name in the neighborhood, attended their school events, and became the kind of officer he should have been from the start. As the game entered its final minutes, the score was tied. Nobody really cared who won. That wasn't the point. The real victory was in the stands, where officers' families sat next to community members, where former adversaries shared popcorn and conversation, where fear had been replaced by friendship. Last play of the game, the announcer called out. The ball moved around the court, passed between officers and teenagers, until it reached Williams's son. Cooper was guarding him, but not like that night a year ago. This time, there was respect in their eyes, understanding in their movements. The boy faked left, went right, and took his shot as the buzzer sounded. The ball asked through the air as everyone held their breath. When it swished through the net, the crowd erupted, not because one team had won, but because everyone had. After the game, as people mingled on the court, Cooper approached Williams and his son. "Thank you," he said simply, "for showing me how to be better, for giving me the chance to change." The boy looked at Cooper, then at his father, and finally at the crowd of people around them, all the lives touched by what had happened that night a year ago. "Sometimes," he said, "the worst moments can lead to the best changes, if we're brave enough to learn from them." As the sun set on the basketball court, kids kept playing pickup games under the lights. Officers stayed to play with them, their badges glinting in the evening light, no longer symbols of fear, but of protection and trust. The sound of laughter and bouncing balls echoed through the neighborhood, a reminder that healing is possible, that change is real, and that sometimes the best way forward is together. The Unity game would become an annual tradition, but its spirit lived on every day in the small moments of trust rebuilt, in the friendships formed, and in the understanding that community and police could work together to create something better than fear. They could create hope.